Hi, welcome to the Christian Contrast, where we talk about how walking with Jesus leads us to live differently than those in the world around us. And I love to do a podcast episode like this every year. I'm going to talk about books. I like to encourage reading. I know not everybody's going to be a voracious reader in the way that some of us just love to read, and that's okay. I still think reading is a very wonderful thing for all of us. On this podcast, we talk about ideas and we look to dig into what the Bible has to say about them, and we look to take them deeper than just the surface arguments that we're having and see what's behind them. Reading is often a way to do that. In fact, both with fiction and nonfiction, it can be a way to do that. And so as I was looking through what I wanted to do for this year, sometimes I just recommend 5 books that I think are great books for all time, for anybody to read. But this time, I'm going to talk about 5 books that I think are incredibly timely for things that we're dealing with as a culture right now. In fact, 4 of them, I'm fairly certain 4 of them came out this year. One of them is much older, but dealing with themes that really connect to cultural questions that we're dealing with right now. But before I get into these 5, I wanted to real quick mention there are certain books that I'm just always recommending. Always recommending to people who are readers, always recommending to people who maybe aren't voracious readers but are looking for something good. So if you're looking for good books to read, here's 5 quick ones. The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, Counterfeit Gods by Timothy Keller, A Future Grace by John Piper. I read that one pretty much every year. Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. These are books that over my life I have come back to again and again. I don't read all 5 of these every year, probably, but in any given year, I probably read at least 3 of these books. They're that good. I keep coming back to them. So if you're looking for good reads that are just good reads for any time, for any person, not to any particular culture, these are 5 great books. But now let's walk through 5 books from this year, at least for me, from this year, that are very timely for things that we're dealing with as a culture. Book number 1 is 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age by Rosaria Butterfield. And this book, the title kind of walks through what this book is about, but a lot of the lies that Butterfield walks through start with things that we're dealing with in a culture related to gender and sexuality, but then going backwards from sort of the surface questions that we're asking and the way that we've ended up at as a culture, and going back to questions about identity, going back to questions about even anthropology and what are we as human beings, and going back to sort of what is the root lie, what is at the center of the lie that has ended up emerging into something that's become a very big and accepted part of our culture. I'll warn you, this book is bold. Like this book, if you're looking for a book that's gentle, this is probably not the book to read. And it's actually interesting. In fact, I think for Rosaria Butterfield, that's very, very purposeful. Now, some of you know who she is and know a little bit of her story, but she has quite the testimony. She was a pretty radical feminist and was a women's studies professor. She was in a long-term lesbian relationship, and then through really gospel-fueled hospitality and conversations, she ended up coming to faith in Jesus in a really radical, life-transforming way. And she's told that story in different parts. That story is woven through some of this book, but the purpose of the book is not just to tell her testimony. But the reason why I think that's pertinent is because it would be hard to accuse Rosaria Butterfield of like, you're in your own echo chamber. You just don't know what things are like out there. She does know. She was very much in this world and has a radical testimony of being converted, not just out of certain behaviors, but out of an entire worldview that was antagonistic to Christianity. And part of what it talks about in the book, but what she believes that she's seeing is that it's not only that there's compromises going on in churches and amongst Christians now, compromises at the level of affirming same-sex marriage or something like that, but there also is just sort of a spirit of accommodation and almost this idea of like, if we're just like super polite and gentle and sort of listen and always assume that that's sort of like the best solution to this is just more gentleness and more accommodation. She really believes sort of like there may have been a time where that was the order of the day, but that's not the order of the day right now. So this book is very bold. It's not pointed at the idea that we are looking to go and march and hold signs in front of people's houses, but that we are to much more aggressively take on the lies that are infiltrating, especially the churches. And so the boldness could be towards non-Christians who are buying into these lies, but is really bold towards Christians who are buying into these lies and towards Christian leaders who are not doing much to subvert these lies. It's a wonderful book. Again, it's very, very timely. It's one that can mark for great discussion if you have a book reading group, or even if as a family you wanted to discuss certain themes in it. If your kids are kind of to the teenage years or a little bit older, that would be appropriate for them. It's a really wonderful book. It's really worth reading. 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age by Rosaria Butterfield. Now, one of the reasons why I talked about that book first is because the second book on my list was one that emerged because Rosaria Butterfield promoted it and talked about it in her book, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. And this is the one book on my list here that's an old book. And it's called The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment by Jeremiah Burroughs. Now, so a little bit of fair warning on this. This book it's not super long. It's a little bit of a slog in the way that it's written, just in the sense that it's a little repetitive and it's kind of thorough, just in the sense of it's sort of like Jeremiah Burroughs is constantly looking to make the argument and leave no stone unturned, and in the overall discussion about contentment and just walking with Jesus in a way that we're content. But one of the reasons why it came up in Butterfield's book is because when she was talking about issues related to sexuality and gender, one of the points that she was making is that some of what drives that is envy and lack of contentment, wanting what God hasn't given us. And so she pointed to contentment a lot. And this book, even though there is a sense of like, all right, this is kind of repetitive, you got to get some momentum going. And once you get some momentum going, you get through it. There was a point where I even asked, like, do I want to keep reading this? I'm so glad I did. I feel like there is just a great, rich benefit from this. And one of the great, rich benefits that I thought it brought is it just really reveals how incredibly entitled we are in our culture to have somebody walk through just the humility and the incredible gratitude and the reception of trials and difficulties that we ought to have as we're walking with Jesus. We believe that our lives should be incredibly smooth and easy. And if our lives aren't incredibly smooth and easy, we're looking at God like, what the heck are you doing? Why aren't you going along with the script? So part of what the book brings out is just the idea that God sharpens us and shapes us through trials and difficulties. And so it's not just a sense of contentment in saying, well, God didn't owe me anything anyway, and so what am I complaining about? Even though that's fair enough, it's really instead looking at it and saying, I am receiving what God has given me. And I know that it's not only something where he doesn't have an obligation to me, but these are good gifts from God to shape me into who he's making me to be. Man, if we put into practice the themes and the truths in this book, we would all be richer and better in our lives for it, and we would have much more perseverance in our trials. And so speaking of perseverance, you will need a little bit of perseverance. It's a little bit of an older book. It's a little bit of a slog. It's worth it. And so if you're not really a reader, I don't know that I would recommend starting with that out of the 5 books that I've recommended, or even of the 5 that I recommended before these recommendations. But especially if you are somebody that reads a lot, I'd say, man, it will be worth your time. The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment by Jeremiah Burroughs. All right, so quick note before I go to the next 3 books that I'm going to talk about. None of the next 3 books are overtly Christian books, even though 2 of them are written by believers. They're social science books. and they're dealing with themes in our culture. And I found them, all three of them, incredibly helpful and incredibly valuable as we as Christians look to think through from a biblical perspective things that are happening in our culture and how we respond to them in our lives, how we respond to them in the church, how we respond to them in our families. And so the first one, some of you might have heard of this book, is called Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier. And this is a book that definitely made the rounds this year. If you're a podcast listener, there's a whole bunch of podcasts that she was on talking about this book. And when you hear the term bad therapy, or when you hear the title Bad Therapy, you might sort of assume, all right, this is going to be something that's very anti-therapy. Abigail Shrier is not anti-therapy. She's not anti-counseling. And I'm not either. And so you don't need to go into this book and say like, all right, I'm going to prepare myself for the idea that she's going to say like therapy is a big scam. That's really not what she's doing. When she's talking about bad therapy, what she's talking about is more the normalization of the idea that things that we're going through in our lives, that we treat them as so abnormal that we sort of pathologize them and make them something that we need therapy for. And she takes this on especially with young people, especially with kids. The idea that we're looking at kids and sort of as an automatic being like, we got to get them into counseling. When really one of the things that we're doing by doing that is we're telling them what you're going through and what you're experiencing is not normal, when many of the things that they're experiencing are just the normal elements of discomfort that go along with life. And it was interesting that this isn't in the book, but this is just something maybe as an illustration of why I think this book is important. So this was probably I'm guessing this was probably in 2021 or late in 2020. So this was still kind of during COVID, but things were mostly reopened. Churches were mostly reopened, but there were still people, and by this point, so this must have been in 2021, because the vaccine was widely available. Anybody who wanted it could have had it at this point, and there were still people, and I knew many of them, that were having a really hard time reemerging, not just in church, but just sort of in general. And so I remember I did a video where I tried to be as gentle as I could, but to speak to people that hadn't yet emerged and to say, hey, I get it. I know that there's people dealing with anxiety, and I know that there's people that don't just deal with sort of normal anxiety, but deal with an anxiety that's stronger than what the rest of us deal with. And I tried to be as sympathetic as possible, and then to say, even though it feels uncomfortable, you've got to reemerge. Like you need people. You can't stay in this state of just not reacclimating yourself to society and being around people, and especially if you're a believer, gathering with the church. And I ended up having one piece of feedback from somebody that I didn't know, was sort of a friend of a friend, that his response to the video was basically, well, this guy, talking about me, this guy just doesn't know what it's like. Like this guy just doesn't get it. If he knew what it was like, he never would have said this. And to me, it was very sad, because what in essence he seemed to be saying was, in fact, I think he did say this overtly, is he said, what he doesn't realize is we can't. And to me, my response was just to say, what is your alternative? Like, maybe you're right that even with the sympathy I'm trying to give, I still don't get just how difficult it feels to you. But what is your alternative? Is your alternative just to sort of stay apart from people for the rest of your life? Like, there's not a good alternative. You've got to push through in this. And I think that that's something that's illustrative to what she's dealing with in the book, that there is not this sense of, hey, we need to cultivate the idea of, yes, this is uncomfortable. Yes, this is unpleasant. This is kind of normal life. You need to find a way to deal with it. And instead, we're saying, especially to children, like, oh gosh, you feel uncomfortable in your own body. You feel uncomfortable with anxiety, just sort of over school and over sports and over kind of normal things in life. Oh my gosh, we got to get you into counseling. We got to get you onto medicine. Instead of saying, you're going to deal with discomfort in your life. And I think that this is a really important pushback to where our culture has gone in terms of therapy and counseling. Once again, and well, all right, this is the last time I'll give the qualifier on this. I'm not anti-counseling. I've experienced counseling. Karina and I have experienced counseling. It was very helpful in both of those cases. So I'm not anti the idea that this is present, but sort of the normalization of it, that sort of like this is a normal thing that basically everybody needs to do. And if you're experiencing even what should be a small problem, you should go and do this. And then even the extended nature of it, instead of seeing it as something that you do for a while and you sort of get some guidance and get some tools and get some help and deal with some stuff, and then you look to emerge from that and apply those to your life, the idea that you're just perpetually in this mode of getting therapy and counseling, I think is something that we need to challenge and we need to push back against, especially when it comes to kids. Just the idea that we have a whole bunch of people talking about the idea of I have anxiety as if it's sort of this official eternal thing that's a part of their being, in the same way that hair color and skin color and things like that, height is a part of it. Instead of saying, all right, you're dealing with anxiety, that's not necessarily the mark of your life for the rest of your life. So how do you get the tools to deal with this? So I feel like this is an incredibly helpful book. She does walk through some of the unique ways that we've got to where we are that I think are instructive to those of us who feel like what we're doing right now is just normal. So Abigail Shrier, Bad Therapy, highly recommend. I think it's a great book. That's the one of these five that I mentioned, the one that she's not a believer, as far as I can tell. But I think that the things that she deals with are very helpful in equipping us and helping us to think about the facts from a Christian worldview. The last two are written by believers, but they're both social science books in the same way that Bad Therapy is a social science book. So book number 4 that I'll recommend is just called Get Married by Brad Wilcox. And actually not too long ago, we did a Dan Reacts video about Brad Wilcox video where he was talking about his book, Get Married, and talking about the research behind it. So Brad Wilcox is a researcher, and this is a research-based book. While he is a Christian, and he does have a Christian worldview, he really deals with it just from the social science standpoint of saying, what are the benefits of marriage? Why should you get married? And what is happening with marriage becoming less and less normal and people waiting longer and longer to get married. And he talks about this sort of from two ends, where he talks about the idea that from the male standpoint, you have sort of the manosphere out there and this message to men that marriage is a bad deal for you. And if you get married and then your wife could take you from all your worth, or at least half your worth, and you could end up in this bad deal. And, like 70% of divorces are initiated by women, and sort of, marriage is a bad deal for you guys. So don't get married, or at least wait a long time to get married. And then from women, there's the more feminist standpoint of this, of like, hey, don't get tied down by no man, the patriarchy, things like that. And so with both men and women, you have voices that are discouraging marriage, or at the very least discouraging marriage as we might treasure it and think about, like marriage, but keep yourself safe, marriage, but keep your money separate, those sorts of things. Brad Wilcox walks through in this book, first of all, just the benefits, the sort of objective benefits that happen to people in terms of health, in terms of earning power, in terms of happiness, just reported happiness, all these different things that happen in people's lives just through getting married. And then the other element that he talks about, because he's not blind to the fact that a lot of marriages today end in divorce, talks about what are the factors that lead to people staying married. And this is not new. It's interesting. Nothing that he talks about in here is stuff that if you're in this world and sort of know what's going on, you know that this is true, that there are these big surprises. It's one of my friends who, actually the friend that told me about this book, joked about the idea that it's like every 3 years, there's a study that comes out that says like Christian married couples are having more and better sex than anybody else, and everybody acts shocked by it. And then 3 years later, they come up with another study that says the exact same thing, and everybody acts shocked by it. So there's things in this book that are consistent with what, if you're paying attention, we sort of already knew about this. But one of the elements that he talks about as just a core element to tying couples together is couples who are involved with church together. Now, for a long time, there sort of has been this talking point that the rate of divorce amongst Christians is the same as the rate of divorce amongst non-Christians. And the only possible way that could be construed as being true is if people are marking on a census like, yes, my religion is Christian, and then you just, without any other follow-ups, take all the data and just sort of compare it to each other. When it comes to couples who are together attending church services with any regularity, the rate of divorce plummets. To those that their religion or their faith is very important, that they mark that it's very important to their lives, rates of divorce plummet. And so this is just a point of encouragement for those of us who are married and are wanting to stay married and are wanting to have thriving marriages. Being involved in your church together, consistently, prioritizing Jesus as the center of your home and being around other people and other couples and other families that are looking to make things work is just about the best thing that you could do for your marriage. So it's an enjoyable book. It's very accessible and very interesting, and once again, very timely. Get Married by Brad Wilcox. And finally, the fifth book, and probably to me the most memorable book of any book that I read all year, is called Hannah's Children by Catherine. I think the way you pronounce her last name is Pakulak. This is another social science book. Catherine, she does identify herself as a Christian, but what she does in this book is she interviews a series of women who have at least 5 children, some of them up to like 9 or 10 children. And it's all about like what is going on, what is driving the women in our culture that are defying the norms when it comes to either not having kids or just having 1 or maybe 2 kids and are having a whole bunch of kids and looking to find common threads. So this is an enjoyable book to read just because it is about different people's stories. And for these different women, it's about both what led them to make these countercultural decisions. And it's interesting because some of them did come from big families. And so for them and for their husbands, this was sort of normal that they thought big families were great. They had lots of siblings. They thought that that's a great way to go, and they wanted to repeat that. And for others, it's not the case. For others, they might have come from homes that were opposed to this or just homes where they were the only child. The common thread through it, though, is that all of them, every single one of the couples who are practicing this in the book are very religious. Most of them are Christian or Catholic. There was a couple of observant Jewish couples who were part of it also. But it's one of the things that she says throughout the book. She says, not every religious couple has a bunch of kids, but every couple that has a bunch of kids is religious. Like this is just a common thing throughout the book. And so that's striking. And one of the things about this is I think that this is important in our culture. Right now, we are at a point where we just don't value children in the way that Jesus would lead us to value children. Of course, abortion is the biggest way in our culture that we devalue children, that we not only kill our children before they're born, but that we sort of champion this idea that nobody's life should have to be interrupted by an unwanted child, even if you've done all the things that should have prepared you for the idea that a child might come from what you're doing. It's not only talking about the abortion, and abortion does come up in some ways in the book, but just about our overall attitude towards like, all right, well, like maybe I do want to have kids, but like just 1 because kids are expensive, or just 2 because I don't know that we could really do what we need to do with kids if we had more than 2. And then that we're sort of trying to tell both men and women, but maybe in particular women, like, hey, hold on to your life. Don't like make sure you don't disappear. Make sure that your kids sort of don't take over all this, and make sure you have a life and a marriage of your own. And then we're celebrating the idea. Oh, isn't it great that once kids are older and you don't have to do as much for them? And isn't it great once they're out of the house and you can go on cruises and go on trips? In fact, one of the things, because I'm at Karina and I are at the life stage now where our kids are still in the home. We've got 1 in college, but we can sort of start to feel the sense of like, okay, there's a day coming in the not too distant future where we're going to be empty nesters. And it can be very easy to look at that as like, man, that's when we get to do again all of these things that we used to get to do before we had kids. And now we'll have probably more money than we did in our early days of marriage, less health. So let's make sure we hit the gym and make sure we're healthy, and so that we can still move around and do these things. And it's not that there's no validity in saying, hey, each new stage has its unique things. But part of the beauty of this book was hearing from these different women and these different families, and seeing as their kids grew, how they continued to prioritize them and continued to prioritize their families and their children. And to me, it was a beautiful picture of saying, all right, as I think about my future for as long as the Lord has me here, I don't want to look at this and say, well, all right, for these however long it'll be with our 3 kids, to say, all right, for these 26 years or whatever of parenting while our kids are, we have a child under 18, those are the years that we gave ourselves to that. But then after that, anything with our kids is sort of like extra or maybe like a side hobby. But the real stuff that we're doing is like all of the fun, adventuring, exploring stuff that we had to put on hold for a while. Instead of saying, man, if our kids, we want our kids still involved in our lives. We want to be helping them with different things. If they get married, we want to be a support to them. If they have kids, we want to be involved in that. We want to have multi-generational involvement. So I think that this book is a beautiful picture of all of this. If you're at a point where you're sort of in the childbearing stage, I just highly recommend that you read this book. It doesn't mean that God is going to call you to have 7 kids, but I think it's an invitation to view what we do in parenting differently. It's a beauty. It made me super grateful for having kids, super grateful for having 3 kids, and made me even be like, gosh, if anything, I certainly don't regret that we had 3. If anything, I'm like, man, maybe we should have had more. Like, who knows? There's this beautiful faith-filled element to it that I think is worth all of us taking on in a culture where we don't really value kids and we look at them as a threat to our freedom. So Hannah's Children. Oh, by the way, the title Hannah's Children is sort of a double reference because there is a mother named Hannah in the book. That's one of the women that they interview, but also referring to the biblical Hannah, who was Samuel's mother, but who longed for children and didn't have children, and just the spirit of longing for children and longing for the idea of that being a wonderful thing and not a bummer, not something that you just sort of have to put up with in life. So I highly recommend all 5 of those books. We'll put links to each of them in the description for this podcast episode. There's lots of great books out there. Hopefully you take on reading, and hopefully you take on reading some of these, because I think that these are timely as we look to form a biblical framework and a biblical worldview for dealing with issues that are timely in our culture right now. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this. We put out episodes of The Christian Contrast every 2 weeks. And so if you found this helpful, in fact, if you want more book recommendations, you can probably go back to episodes in past Decembers and find that I usually do one like that right about this time of year and just encourage people to read and encourage people with books that I found valuable. So you can check out that, and you can also check out all the back episodes that we have of different topics that we've talked about, different interviews that we've had, and different subjects that we've covered as we've looked to talk about how walking with Jesus leads us to live differently than those in the world around us. So once again, thanks for taking the time to listen, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode.